It's a very involved story. My mother reads up until Papa comes through the door. When Papa came through the door, my mother closed the book, called my sister, said, "Your brother is a heretic." That's my mother, you know. And she believed it. She thought, how can this be, you know? And the short form of the story is that in 1946, my mother went into nurses training in a city in Canada, Victoria, 3-year program. There was a family in the city that were trying to have a baby, Mr. and Mrs. Munn, and they'd had 5 second trimester miscarriages in a row. And in 1946, there's no neonatal. Well, they tried one more time, and my mother had been in nurses training 3 months when Mrs. Munn came into the hospital bleeding. And she was examined, and they said, "We have to take the baby." Well, the doctor rushes in, says, "We got emergency C-section." He grabs the head nurse to assist and a student nurse to assist and to do the cleanup and to learn, and that was my mother, 3 months into nurses training. They delivered a 1-pound baby boy, 16 ounces, and the doctor puts the baby in a kidney tray, hands him to my mother and says, "Dispose of it," which meant the incinerator. Well, he goes back, finishes the operation. My mother's looking at this baby, and he's still breathing, and she doesn't know what to do. In 1946, you don't disobey a doctor, you know. So she finds a washcloth, puts the baby in a washcloth, puts him back in the kidney tray, and puts him on top of the sterilization unit, the only warm place in the room. And her goal is, I'll wait till the baby dies, and then I can obey the doctor. Well, the doctor leaves, and the head nurse takes the woman to post-op, leaving my mother to do the cleanup, which she does, and then she holds this baby waiting for him to die. That was 8:30 p.m., May the 30th, 1946. The doctor meets with the parents, says, "I'm sorry the baby didn't survive." He goes home. 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, my mother's still holding the baby in the operating room, waiting for him to die. 12:30, 1:30 in the morning, she says to herself, "I should probably tell somebody about this." So she calls the head nurse, and she says, "We are in so much trouble." They call the doctor, and he comes in furious. He just rips into my mom for disobeying him. Well, he says, "You created this problem, now you got to clean the mess up." So my mother is given responsibility for a 1-pound baby boy. And the parents were told, "Sorry, but we spoke too soon, but due to the miracles of modern medicine, And so they name him Harold, and my mother takes little Harold up to the nursery. They begin to feed him with an eyedropper, and over the next 2 days, he loses 4 ounces, 1/4 of his body weight. And then he begins to pick up weight. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Munn goes home. 2 months later, little tiny Harold goes home to his parents. And 2 years later, my mother gets invited to his 2nd birthday. And she goes and she sees him. And he looks perfectly normal, but she says nothing. She graduates, goes to Bible school, meets my father, they get married. When I'm 10 months old, we go to New Guinea. And years later, I'm graduating high school in northern British Columbia in Canada. And my mother's working with a nurse who's an Anglican nurse. Mr. Munn had been the Anglican pastor at a church in Victoria. And she saw an obituary for a Bishop Munn who has passed away. So she asked the nurse, "Did you know Bishop Munn?" "Yes." "Did he have any children?" "Oh, yeah, 1 son." "Do you know where he is?" She says, "Last I heard, he's a missionary teacher in West Africa." She says nothing for another 10 years until she reads the obituary of the doctor who got so mad. He's now dead, right? That's the first time she told her own family the story. And now she decides the doctor's dead, she can track down Harold and tell him the real story, which she does, and she finds that he is the senior pastor of the Anglican Church in Victoria, and right down the street from where his father pastored. Well, she gets a hold of them, they talk, and my mother tells Harold the real story. And he says, "We always knew." Well, they've gotten to be friends, and at one point my mother says to Harold, "I have this son who wrote this book, and I'm having a problem with it." And Harold says, "Well, why don't you let me read it, and I'll tell you what I think." "Oh, would you do that?" So Harold reads The Shack, sends me an email and says, "I love your book, but I think I know what your mom's struggling with. It's the imagery you use for God the Father. Let me see if I can do something about that." So Harold blind copies me on an email to my mother, says, "Bernice, I read Paul's book. I love his book. I think you're struggling with the imagery he uses for God the Father. Let me tell you why that imagery is so important to me. And Harold then lays it out. We know God's not male or female. God is spirit. All of maleness, all of femaleness are both derived from the nature and character of God. And, imagery doesn't define God. And he goes on. And here this little baby, 1 pound baby that my mother saves in 1946, decades later becomes the person who builds the bridge that she can walk across for her own son.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow.
That's the story of my mom. And she now loves the book because of Harold.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for that. Thank you.
You're welcome.